Good evening and welcome to another episode of Rich Politics with me, your host, Richard Taylor. Thank you so much for taking the time to tune in. Don't forget to follow us on all the social media platforms. We'd really appreciate it. Well, tonight we're going to be talking about, you guessed, we're talking about Boris's green, I was going to say monster, but his green agenda. And joining me on the show tonight to discuss this is a good friend of mine. He's a businessman. He runs his own business called InControl, which specialises in assistance, technology and smart home solutions. And he's a former Brexit Party candidate as well, 2019, and a very good friend. Rick, welcome to Rich Politics.
Rich, thanks for having me on.
It's great to have you, mate. You're looking very well there.
Yeah, surviving, keeping going.
Good, Rick. So I want to get you on because obviously there's a lot going on next week. COP26 kicks off. Boris has launched this massive green agenda. I don't think it's the Conservative Party anymore. I call him the Green Party now with a blue jacket on. I mean, what's your thoughts around, first of all, let's talk about the boilers. Now, we know the government have offered grants up to £5,000. I think there's around 27 million homes in the country. I mean, is it a realistic target? Is it going to happen? They want to get to net zero by 2050. You know, we on our TV screens at the moment, it's been flooded with climate change stuff. In reality, though, to people in communities in Blackburn, where you are, and in Wales here, I mean, how realistic is it that people will convert to these boilers in the next couple of decades?
Well, I think if we actually want to get to net zero by 2030 or 2050, they change the targets. But, you know, it's possible. My issue is, what is it going to cost? And there's obviously the cost to the taxpayer, but more of a concern is the cost to the average family. And my biggest problem when we're talking about this, and heat pumps are a prime example, is there's not the honesty about what it's actually going to cost people on a house by house basis to convert from a gas boiler to a heat pump, and then what that's going to mean for the running costs as well.
I mean, yeah, I mean, how feasible is it? You talk about, let's say, for example, I'll give you an example. Let's say now I wanted one of these heater, boilers, whatever they're called. What would I have to do? You know, do I, as well as the £5,000 grant, if I chuck £5,000 of my money to get one of these boilers, I mean, how big is it? How would it work? I live in a new build, right? It's a new house. I mean, how feasible is it for me to get one of these boilers?
Well, I mean, it's certainly possible to install. I mean, you're looking at about a square metre, by about 500, about half a metre deep, needs to go on an outside wall for an air source heat pump. But also, it depends what you're converting from, because if you're converting from a combi boiler, you now need a water tank for your hot water. You potentially need buffer vessels as well. So there's more space going to be taken up inside by the kit. And then there's what sort of pipe work you've got that feed your radiators. You know, if you're on 10 mil microbore pipe work, that isn't going to cope with the lower temperatures that air source heat pumps work at. If you're on underfloor throughout, it's much easier to convert because underfloor is really compatible with it, because on a gas boiler you'd be cooling the water before it goes to your underfloor. But no one sort of talks about worst case. I mean, I costed switching to a heat pump for a customer fairly recently. And by the time we'd equated to switching out all the existing pipe work, upgrading to bigger radiators throughout, and adding insulation into the house, because that's another important factor, you were talking 20 grand plus the VAT.
Wow.
And that didn't include
wow,
£20,000. And that didn't include patching up where we'd have to damage decoration or anything.
Yeah, so I should imagine then the government are not being upfront really. I mean, this kind of throwaway statements by the governments, you know, saying, look, we need to do this to help our CO2 emissions. And you know, granted that we're one of the lowest outputs of CO2 in the world. I mean, you look at China, India, the USA, you know, we're not really doing that bad. Granted, we need to look after the environment. But let's say you live in a much older house. I mean, is it harder for people who live in older properties to be able to convert?
It is generally yes, because they're harder to insulate. I mean, when I bought the house that I'm in now, the previous owners had the cavity walls filled, and I had to rip a lot of that out because it was causing so many damp problems. This is one of the things with houses lasting longer and longer. You know, 100 years ago, no one was thinking about even gas boilers. You know, it was coal fires and so on. And no one foresaw needing to insulate a property to the degree that we do now. And if the insulation's added and retrofitted and it's done wrong, it can do a lot of damage to the structure of the house. It's not as simple as people make out, just to bang a load of loft insulation in, insulate the cavity walls, and have done with it.
Yeah. Just moving the conversation on to kind of other areas of energy. Of course, the government are talking an awful lot about wind, wind farms and wind energy, as opposed to other options, and nuclear is there as an option as well. I mean, what's your thoughts around that, Rick? What do you think the government should be doing right now? Because I just think that this green agenda, this is me personally, is going to have a huge impact on the lowest paid people in society. I think it's almost another tax for them, where we're going to have to pay through the nose. We'll talk about electric cars, no doubt, in a few moments as well. But how can we get energy without it having an effect on people's pocket? We can't. We're gonna have to pay for it, aren't we? That's the truth, isn't it?
Well, we're always going to have to pay for the energy we're using. But I mean, if you look at the cost of gas versus electric, with heat pumps, people talk about 2 to 3 times more efficient. And that's best case, but electricity is 2 to 3 times the cost of gas. So by the time you've actually changed over to a heat pump, you're not saving your money. The economics aren't there. Granted, it's a cleaner way of heating your house. I think what we need to be looking at is how we get to reliable, secure, sustainable, clean energy. Which means we're not relying on interconnects from the continent. I mean, if you look, we've got France threatening to cut interconnects. Another dummy spitting exercise by France, but there we go. The other month, we had to fire up coal-fired power stations because there wasn't enough wind to run wind turbines. And you've got to kind of factor all these in. And I think what we really need to be doing is focusing on developing nuclear power. It's proven to be reliable. And when you look at some of the stuff like Rolls-Royce are doing with small modular reactors, you're not necessarily talking huge power plants, but then with some more development, we could be looking at thorium reactors, which would take depleted uranium waste and repurpose it as fuel for those reactors. And I think that's the way we need to be heading, because if you want people to be cleaner in how they live, instead of waving a stick to beat them with and throwing tax on, the people that are most going to be affected by that are the lowest earners. I think we need to be making electricity cheaper, and if you can make it cleaner and cheaper, then people are going to use it.
Yeah, well, it's not cheaper at the moment. We know that with these price hikes and stuff like that. I mean, I was down in Port Talbot last week at one of Farage's tours with GB News, and I was in Port Talbot, which is the heart of, the steelworks there, has been for many years, and there's 4,000 people that work in that place, and it's a small community. Of course, this kind of green agenda puts pressure on big companies like that are working over here, because it threatens their jobs, because they can have to go to an alternative. They can't afford it. They go to business, and people lose their jobs. So there is a wider societal impact, Rick, isn't there, on people's jobs as well, which I think this green agenda could potentially have, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the way a lot of manufacturing has gone to China, part of that is because they don't have the not only the employment standards but the environmental standards that we have, and I think that the employment standards, the environmental standards that we have are good, they're worth having, and we absolutely shouldn't compromise on those. But at the same time, you've got to balance that with businesses that will say, well, I can make this cheaper in another country and then import it. So all you're doing in that respect is we can say, oh, yeah, we've hit our carbon target. But all we've actually done is thrown it on another country somewhere else. And then you're producing more carbon to ship the stuff back to us.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. Importing, energy or electricity to us from other countries doesn't seem to make any sense to me whatsoever. I mean, we've made huge advancements in technology, which has really helped, to make our planet a safer, cleaner place. For example, solar. I remember I was a salesman for solar panels many, many moons ago when they first came out, when you could get them on a grant from the government. And I remember the amount of people that wanted solar panels, because obviously, to get electricity is a lot cheaper as well at the time. I mean, the government obviously clearly want to get to net zero by 2050, but is it a pipe dream and is it achievable? There's going to be thousands of people in Glasgow flooding, for the COP26. I just wonder, with all the rhetoric we're going to hear and all the stuff they're going to talk about, which they normally do, Is it a real reality? Can it really happen by 2050? Let's be honest.
Well, I mean, a lot of it is going to depend on technology. I mean, when you look, it takes about 20 years, I think, to build a nuclear power plant. We've got existing ones that are going to be decommissioned well before then. So we should have started 10, 15 years ago with nuclear if we're going to hit our carbon targets. Ultimately, it's possible, but I think we've got to look at what the cost is, and not just the cost to the economy and the taxpayer's purse, but the cost to the lowest paid people in the country, who at the moment, some of them struggle to heat their houses, or with the price of gas as it is at the moment. You tell them they've got to pay 3-4 times as much to heat the house. Well, how are they going to manage that?
Yeah. I think we talked about the advancement in technology. We talked about electric cars, for example. I was listening to the radio this morning, and there's a new electric car factory in Camden in London, and they were talking about these cars, and one car was priced at £85,000. Now, to our viewers who live in Wales, they know very well, for 85 grand, you can buy 2 bloody houses here in Wales, right? So never mind an electric car. I mean, the issue with electric cars is one of charging ports. It's one of the whether or not, you can get the mileage out of them. They're efficient enough to do 250, 300 miles. The cost is obviously the biggest hurdle you've got. So what we've got at the moment, Rick, is, for me, it's like this. You've got the poorest families with the highest rises in taxes. If you're low paid, your national insurance is going up, your gas electric bill's going up, and then they want you to have a boiler. It's going to cost you 5, maybe 20 grand, as you mentioned, one case there, extra, and then a car, 85 grand. I mean, I know there's cheap electric cars, but put into context, it doesn't make any sense to normal thinking people, does it?
No, it doesn't. I mean, with electric cars, I mean, I can drive to Paris and fill up with diesel once on the way. With an electric car, I'd have to charge 3 times, I guess, on the way. That's going to take me a lot longer. But then there's also the batteries. When we're looking at the environmental impact, we're not looking about the cobalt that's being mined, often with slave child labor in Africa, to get the cobalt for the batteries, and then what we do with the batteries afterwards, and I think instead of the fancy targets and saying, we can do this, and fudging the statistics, what we need to do is open it up and be honest and say, well, we can use electric cars, but what we're going to do with all the batteries and so on afterwards. I mean, there's not going to be, as things stand at the moment, there's not going to be much of a second-hand market for electric cars, simply because of the cost to replace the batteries. And this doesn't, for me, get talked about anything like enough. No. When we're talking about how we're going to get to net zero, because if we're not honest about it and we're not looking pragmatically at it, either it's not going to happen, or it's going to be a disaster.
Yeah, and I think the appetite to go greener is out there amongst the public. So I'll give you an example. If I could have a boiler for free that saved the environment, I'd have it. If I could get an electric car for the same price as a second-hand car, or one I could afford or I could finance, whatever my financial circumstances are, I'd get electric car. I think so it's not as if we're against this whole idea of Boris pushing this green agenda, but I'm getting the impression from this Conservative government at the moment that they're kind of burying a lot of this big, serious issues, which we're going to come to in a few moments. I'm going to ask you your thoughts, because with a different hat on, because I know you're the chairman of the Blackburn Conservative Association up there as well. So I'll talk to you about that in a few moments, about what's recently happened in the House of Commons on the vote on the Coronavirus Act, or the lack of there. But I just wonder whether or not the government is banging this drum and trying to divert our attention away from some of the more serious issues that maybe we're facing.
Well, I mean, it could be. I think that there's a tendency to kind of throw the positives out and hold the negatives back, rather than tell people. And you're right. I don't know anyone that doesn't want to be greener, cleaner. Whether they believe in climate change or not, everyone knows that if you're not throwing pollutants into the air, you've got cleaner air, it's a nice place to live. But everyone's got to also think about the pocket and can they afford it. So you're right, if it's all affordable, then people will do it. And I think we need to get away from sort of beating people with a stick to get them to do things, but actually make it financially viable for people to do them, and people will.
Yeah, I think that's the crux of it. I don't think the government have come in clean on the actual cost or what it'll cost each family, home, individual to actually have this green conversion, really. I think that's the issue. And talking about trust, really, in politicians, which I want to finish our conversation on today, Rick. I mean, you saw what happened last week in the House of Commons. There was a debate. I call it a debate. I watched the whole thing, being a commentator on politics myself, needed to. And I was shocked, first of all, to see how few members of parliament there were in the debate around renewing the Coronavirus Act, which gives them legislative power to, at a strike of a pen, in the words of Steve Baker MP, to be able to shut the whole country down again, which is extraordinary power for one man to have. I mean, did you watch it, and what did you make of that vote, or lack of, I should say?
I listened to it while I was working, actually, but yeah, there was so few MPs in the chamber. And I mean, you and I have both stood for Parliament. If you're going to take on that job, you've got a responsibility to represent the people that have elected you. And however you feel about the coronavirus legislation, whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, it absolutely deserves the debate. And yet I was dismayed at how few MPs actually bothered to turn up for that debate. It should have been a full house. But then the disdain showed by the deputy speaker, who laughed through the fact that there was no appetite in the House for a vote.
Yeah, well, I think the word she used is there's no mood. There's no mood in you with laughter, and met with kind of jeering from the backbenches as well. I will say, I listened to Don Butler, who I never agree with on hardly anything, but she wanted it scrapped. I mean, there were some people that spoke out. Steve Baker was one, Liam Fox was another one, but there was very few that actually did, and I was shocked at the attitude by which that they were continuing to impose draconian measures on people's lives for a further 6 months, which will take us to March next year. And I think it's appalling. And I think they've treated the members of the public with great contempt of the scenes I saw in Parliament this week. I mean, did you get that same feeling as well, Rick?
I did. Obviously, like you say, there were MPs, Steve Baker, David Davis, Mark Harper, that spoke out against it. And to be honest, I'm not so much, even though I'm against the legislation, I don't think we need it anymore. I think we're past that point. I'm not particularly miffed with those that spoke in favour of it. Yeah. What I'm more miffed about is the ones that didn't bother to turn up, but then the laughter by the deputy speaker and a few others as they just waved it through without a vote. I mean, it's legislation that affects everyone's lives. And if we're not going to have these things voted on in Parliament because they're not in the mood, well, it's a mockery of democracy. But then why should anyone be in the mood to follow the laws that are then in place because of it?
Yeah, and I think the hypocrisy as well is now, the government is talking about the potential of Plan B. I've heard Plan C as well mentioned about bringing restrictions. We still have restrictions here in Wales. You have to wear a mask in a shop, but you don't have to in a nightclub. That's okay, that is. But of course, England now are facing the potential of a harsh winter, and they're already talking about, Sajid Javid was talking about the potential of another lockdown if people don't take up the boosters. I mean, look, it's going one way, Rick. I mean, I predicted, I think it was last month or month before, that by the end of October, we'd be back into some form of restrictions and lockdowns in the country. I can see it happening because the way this government has worked throughout this pandemic, I can't see them doing it any other way. I mean, we know why they're doing it, right? Protect the NHS, but I'm absolutely fed up to the back teeth of hearing protect the NHS when there are people in my community here and around Wales who can't even get to see their GP. They can't even get to see their doctor. And we're talking about protecting the NHS when there are workers in a new hospital here called the Grange Hospital in Wales, in Cwmbran. It's a brand new hospital. Staff are too scared to go to work, right? So there's a shortage of staff there. There's nothing to do with COVID, nothing to do with COVID at all. They're too scared to go to work because they're afraid of the shortages that are currently there, that they'll be overworked. This is the state of the NHS before COVID. And so these are real issues. And I wonder if the failure is not so much the handling of the pandemic, but the failure of the way that the NHS has been run by successive governments.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, the NHS always gets used as a political football, especially at election times. And it's like you say, it's successive governments that have mismanaged the NHS. The NHS is great at wasting money. I mean, if you look at what we spend on employing a nurse and you look at what we spend on employing a diversity manager, the two are not comparative. You know, we need nurses. I question whether or not we need diversity managers in the NHS.
Yeah.
And I think what we need to do is we need to stop the amount of money that is being wasted in the NHS. And then if the NHS needs more money, then yeah, it needs more money. But the NHS should be there to protect us, not the other way around. And I do sort of caveat that with the first 6 months of the pandemic, no one knew what was going to hit. And you've got to look at that differently. But now we've had plenty of time to see where this is going. But the last 20, 30 years, the NHS has not been looked after the way it should be. And I see it in sort of standards of care being reduced and what's available on the NHS being reduced.
You know, I was saying, Nick, I was going to, sorry to interrupt you there. Before I forget, I need to mention this. I was speaking to a friend a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about the NHS, and we talked about, you know, the kind of pressures it's been under with COVID and everything else, and pre-pandemic, you know, the way that senior management are paid 200,000 plus, and you've got middle management on ridiculous salaries, don't do much. Then you've got those in the front line who are the ones who deserve a clap, you know, the ones who are really working hard on not very good wages, and a 3%, you know, increase they've had this year. Now, I was speaking to him about it, and I recalled a time, I'm going back 15 years ago. I was in the Philippines with my wife. We used to do a lot of charity work out there in orphanages and things. And while I was out there, I ate some food, and the crab was old stock, and it didn't agree with me. And I had food poisoning. I nearly died. It's literally that bad, right? So they chucked me on the back of a motorbike. This is the truth, right? Towel wrapped around my head to keep my head cool because I was burning up. And we're shooting down this dirt road on the back of this motorbike. I'm thinking, where the hell are these guys taking me? This, you know, out in the Philippines. It was in Mindanao, and when I got there, to my utter surprise, the hospital was absolutely spotless. It was incredible. It was like walking into another time zone, and I instantly started to compare it. And I'm going back 15 years ago to the state and the uncleanliness of our hospitals here in the UK. And it honestly, it just blew my mind that in a third world country, the hospital itself that I went to in Mindanao was so clean, and they were so efficient, and the staff was so, you know, friendly. And my mind went back to hospitals in the UK, and I thought, we are way behind in the UK in our hospitals, you know, down to the cleanliness and the buildings. I mean, some of them are ancient. And as I've said to you, I just think the NHS needs massive change. It's an institutional reform that it needs. Do you think so?
Absolutely. I think the NHS needs reform. I mean, it's idolised as a religion by some almost, that you can't criticise it. And the problem with that is you can't look at the good things that the NHS is there for. You know, I mean, free at the point of use for everybody, and the hard work that doctors, nurses, really put into it. You know, I mean, you can't deny that they are worth their weight in gold. But then when you look at the other side of it, and you look at the bloated middle management that just seem to find new and inventive ways to waste money, that is the side of the NHS that needs to reform. The money that we're putting in needs to be going to frontline care, not to pay in an extra bonus for an NHS chief or another layer of management.
Yeah, Rick, listen, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on Rich Politics tonight. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.